"Diana's not leadership material," Thomas Blake, my boss and CEO, announced to the packed Meridian Corporation boardroom. The words hit me like ice water. I sat frozen in my leather chair at the polished mahogany table, surrounded by executives who'd watched me build this company's human resources foundation from startup to Fortune 500 status over 22 years. This was supposed to be my promotion announcement, the executive vice president position I'd worked toward for years. Instead, Thomas stood confidently at the head of the boardroom, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, delivering what felt like a professional execution. My hands remained steady on my portfolio, but my heart was racing. How had this gone so wrong? "Today marks a significant milestone in Meridian's growth," Thomas continued, his voice carrying casual authority. "Our new executive vice president will lead us into the next decade of expansion." Board Chair Jennifer Walsh shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at me with obvious confusion. CFO Michael Torres looked genuinely surprised, his pen frozen over his notepad. Everyone in this room had expected this to be my moment, the logical culmination of 2 decades protecting employees, resolving crises, and building institutional trust. "I'm pleased to announce that Marcus Anderson will be joining our executive team as EVP of Operations," Thomas said, gesturing toward Marcus Anderson, a recent hire who happened to be his golf partner. Marcus, the man who'd been with the company barely 3 years. The same Marcus who called employee complaints HR drama and suggested we streamline harassment protocols to avoid unnecessary complications. My face flushed as 22 years of systematic expertise was being discarded for obvious nepotism. The promotion I'd earned through decades of dedicated service was going to someone whose primary qualification was weekend golf games with the CEO. "Marcus brings the leadership qualities we need moving forward," Thomas continued, his satisfaction growing with each word. "This restructuring also requires other changes." I could feel every eye in the room watching, waiting for my reaction to what everyone knew was systematic professional betrayal. "Diana's going to step down," Thomas announced with calculated pleasantness. "It's what's best for the company." Step down, as if I'd chosen this. As if 22 years of protecting vulnerable employees, building compliance systems, and maintaining institutional integrity could be dismissed with corporate euphemisms. "We all want to thank Diana for her 22 years of service," Thomas added, his tone carrying that patronizing warmth executives use when discarding experienced professionals. Now it's time to move on. What Thomas didn't know, what he'd never bothered to discover in all the years he'd dismissed my work as emotional overinvestment in employee issues, was what sat in my filing cabinet at home. 6 months of systematic documentation. Recorded conversations with harassment victims he'd threatened into silence. Email evidence of his predatory behavior spanning years. Legal consultations with the city's most prestigious employment law firm. Most importantly, the institutional relationships he'd never realized I'd cultivated over 2 decades. Board members who respected my judgment. Regulatory officials who trusted my expertise. Employment law specialists who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of comprehensive case. "Of course, I understand," I replied calmly, reaching into my portfolio and placing a manila folder on the conference table. My voice was steady despite the systematic destruction of everything I'd worked toward. I stood slowly, gathering my belongings with professional dignity. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve." As I walked toward the door, Thomas's confident expression never wavered. He had no idea that the unqualified HR director he'd just dismissed had spent months building his termination case. Tomorrow, he would discover exactly what happens when you systematically underestimate 22 years of institutional expertise. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt surreal. 22 years of institutional knowledge, employee relationships, and corporate expertise dismissed in under 10 minutes. I sat in my car for several moments, letting the full weight of Thomas's calculated betrayal sink in. Marcus Anderson, Executive Vice President. The man who'd suggested we eliminate time-consuming victim interviews to speed up harassment investigations. Who'd recommended we stop documenting complaints that couldn't be substantiated within 48 hours. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Diana, can we talk? This doesn't feel right. Another from Michael Torres. I had no idea this was coming. Are you okay? Even the board members were shocked. Thomas had blindsided everyone, including his own executives, who'd assumed this meeting was about my well-deserved promotion. That evening, I drove home to my quiet townhouse and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the manila folder I'd placed so carefully on the conference table before leaving. Thomas probably hadn't even opened it yet. He was likely celebrating with Marcus, planning their new corporate strategy that would prioritize efficiency over sentiment. What he didn't realize was that folder contained a single document, my resignation letter, dated 3 months ago but never submitted. I'd written it the day I discovered the third harassment complaint against him had been lost in corporate legal review. But I hadn't needed to resign to protect myself. I'd had a better plan. I walked upstairs to my home office and opened my filing cabinet, the same systematic organization Thomas had always mocked as typical HR obsessiveness. Inside were 6 months of meticulous documentation that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. Recorded phone conversations with Sarah Martinez from accounting, who'd confided that Thomas had cornered her in the supply room last December. Jennifer Kim from marketing, who'd been afraid to report the accidental touching during quarterly reviews. Lisa Rodriguez from operations, Amanda Foster from legal, Rebecca Torres from finance, and Maria Gonzalez from customer service. 6 women, 6 separate incidents, all dismissed by Thomas as misunderstandings or office gossip whenever they'd tried to report through proper channels. But they hadn't just reported to Thomas. They'd also confided in me, the HR director they trusted to protect them. The same woman he'd just publicly dismissed as not leadership material. My computer held copies of Thomas's own emails spanning 2 years. Messages where he'd instructed department heads to handle these situations quietly and avoid unnecessary corporate drama. Email chains where he'd questioned victims' motives, suggesting they were seeking attention or trying to damage company reputation. Most damaging was his response to Sarah Martinez's formal complaint. These allegations are clearly fabricated by a disgruntled employee seeking to create problems. I recommend we document her performance issues as grounds for potential termination. Performance issues. Sarah had been Employee of the Month 3 times last year. The phone rang, interrupting my review. Patricia Williams, the employment attorney I'd been consulting for 3 months, calling right on schedule. Diana, I saw the news about your termination. How convenient that Thomas eliminated the one person who could have testified about his systematic harassment cover-ups. Convenient timing, I agreed, but he made one critical mistake. Which was? He assumed that firing me would end the investigation. What he doesn't know is that I haven't been working alone. Patricia's voice carried satisfaction. The EEOC filing goes out tomorrow morning. 6 victim testimonies, documented evidence of systematic cover-up, and proof of retaliation against the investigating officer. Corporate negligence doesn't get much clearer than this. And the timing of my termination? Perfect evidence of witness intimidation. He just handed us the final piece of our case. As I hung up, I looked again at the resignation letter I'd never submitted. Tomorrow, Thomas would discover that the unqualified HR director he'd dismissed had been 3 steps ahead of him for months, and his assumption that I was working alone was about to cost him everything. The next morning, I woke at 5:30, not from anxiety, but from years of disciplined preparation, finally reaching its culmination. While Thomas was probably sleeping peacefully, confident in his corporate maneuvering, I was reviewing the systematic case that would destroy his entire career. My home office looked like a war room. 3 months of legal consultations had taught me exactly how employment law cases were won, through documentation, corroboration, and institutional credibility. Everything Thomas had always dismissed about my work. I opened my laptop and pulled up the victim testimony files. Each woman's story followed the same pattern Thomas had perfected over years of predatory behavior. Sarah Martinez. He said if I wanted to advance at Meridian, I needed to understand that business relationships require flexibility. When I asked what he meant, he put his hand on my thigh during our quarterly review. Jennifer Kim. Thomas told me the marketing budget review would go better if we discussed it over dinner at his place. When I declined, he suggested I wasn't committed to the company's success. Lisa Rodriguez. He cornered me in the elevator and said experienced professionals know how to handle delicate situations. His hand was on my back the entire conversation. 6 testimonies. 6 identical patterns. 6 women who'd been afraid to speak because Thomas had made it clear that stirring up trouble would end their careers at Meridian. But they'd spoken to me, because in 22 years of protecting employees, I'd built something Thomas never understood. Trust. My phone rang. Patricia Williams, calling with our daily case review. Diana, I've been analyzing Thomas's email patterns with our digital forensics team. The systematic nature of his behavior is even worse than we initially documented. How so? He's been using company resources to research each victim's personal information, financial situations, family circumstances, career vulnerabilities. This wasn't opportunistic harassment, it was strategic targeting. I wasn't surprised. Thomas had always been methodical in his exploitation, whether he was targeting vulnerable employees or dismissing experienced professionals who threatened his authority. There's more, Patricia continued. We found emails between Thomas and Marcus Anderson discussing your problematic dedication to employee complaints. They've been planning your removal for months. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined. Yesterday's promotion theft wasn't spontaneous corporate restructuring. It was calculated elimination of the one person who could expose their systematic abuse. The EEOC filing goes out in 2 hours, Patricia said. 6 victim testimonies, documented evidence of institutional cover-up, and proof of witness retaliation. But I want to review the timeline once more. I walked her through the progression. Thomas's first documented harassment incident 18 months ago, the systematic dismissal of complaints, his escalating threats against victims, and finally yesterday's retaliation against me for investigating his behavior. Perfect prosecutorial narrative, Patricia confirmed. Predatory behavior, institutional cover-up, witness intimidation, the employment law textbook case from hell. What about corporate liability? Massive. Meridian's board allowed a known predator to eliminate the investigating officer. The negligence claims alone could cost them millions, not counting individual victim settlements. After we hung up, I reviewed the institutional relationships Thomas had never realized I'd cultivated. Employment law specialists who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of comprehensive case. Regulatory officials who trusted my professional judgment. Board members who'd respected my 22 years of institutional integrity. Most importantly, 6 brave women who'd found courage to speak because they trusted the HR director Thomas had just dismissed as not leadership material. The woman he'd underestimated had spent months building the most systematic harassment case in corporate history. In 3 hours, Thomas would discover exactly what happens when you fire the person who's been documenting your crimes. His assumption that eliminating me would end the investigation was about to become the evidence that destroyed him. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone started ringing. The first call came from Jennifer Walsh, board chair, her voice tight with professional concern. Diana, we need to talk. I've received some very serious documentation from an employment law firm. Is this connected to your termination yesterday? The timing is unfortunate, I replied carefully. But these complaints were filed independently of any personnel decisions. 6 harassment victims? Corporate negligence allegations? Diana, if Thomas knew about these complaints when he terminated you, the EEOC will determine whether yesterday's actions constitute witness retaliation. 20 minutes later, Michael Torres called. Diana, the legal department is in crisis mode. They're saying we could face millions in liability if these allegations are substantiated. What neither board member realized was that I'd been preparing them for this moment for months, not through direct accusations that would have been unprofessional, but through systematic institutional relationship building that Thomas had always dismissed as socializing. Quarterly dinners with Jennifer, where I'd mentioned concerning trends in employee complaints. Coffee meetings with Michael, where I discussed the importance of proper harassment protocols. Casual conversations about employment law changes, and corporate liability risks. I'd been laying groundwork while Thomas assumed I was just networking. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Williams. EEOC filing complete. Media inquiries starting. How do you want to handle corporate response coordination? The institutional backing I'd cultivated was about to reveal itself in ways Thomas had never imagined. At 10:30, my phone rang again. This time, it was Elena Rodriguez from the State Employment Rights Commission, an old colleague from my employment law certification program. Diana, I've been reviewing the Meridian filing. This is exactly the kind of systematic harassment case we've been trying to prosecute for years. The documentation quality is prosecutorial grade. 22 years of HR experience teaches you proper evidence standards, I replied. There's something else. We've had informal complaints about Thomas Blake from other companies where he previously worked. Your case might be the key to establishing a pattern of predatory behavior across multiple employers. Thomas's corporate history was about to be examined under a microscope, all because he'd assumed that firing the unqualified HR director would end his problems instead of triggering a comprehensive investigation. At 11, Patricia called with updates. Diana, the board has requested an emergency meeting. They want to discuss damage control strategies with outside counsel. How fast can corporate liability escalate? With 6 victims, systematic cover-up evidence, and witness retaliation? We're looking at potential 8-figure settlements, not counting criminal referrals for obstruction of justice. Criminal referrals? Thomas used corporate resources to intimidate victims and eliminate the investigating officer. That's not just employment law, it's potential conspiracy charges. I sat back in my chair, reviewing the institutional network Thomas had never bothered to understand. Employment law specialists who'd been waiting for this caliber of evidence, regulatory officials who trusted my professional judgment, board members who'd relied on my expertise for 2 decades. Legal experts who knew that my systematic documentation skills weren't HR obsessiveness, they were prosecutorial precision applied to corporate crime. The phone rang again. Jennifer Walsh, her voice now carrying barely controlled panic. Diana, the board needs to meet with you immediately. We're facing potential bankruptcy if these allegations are proven. Can you come in this afternoon? Of course, I replied calmly. I'll be happy to assist with any institutional compliance issues. What Thomas didn't realize was that the unqualified director he'd dismissed was about to walk back into Meridian Corporation as the key witness in the largest employment law case in company history. His systematic underestimation of my institutional authority was about to cost him everything. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the same conference room where Thomas had destroyed my career less than 24 hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through Meridian's glass lobby, carrying the same leather portfolio that had held my resignation letter yesterday. This time, it contained something far more powerful. Jennifer Walsh met me at the elevator, her face pale with corporate crisis management stress. Diana, before we go in, I need you to understand, the board had no knowledge of Thomas's alleged behavior. We're as shocked as everyone else. I appreciate that clarification, I replied professionally. The boardroom buzzed with tense energy. Michael Torres sat hunched over legal documents, while outside counsel, 3 attorneys from the city's most prestigious corporate defense firm, occupied one entire side of the table. Thomas sat at the head, but his confident posture from yesterday had been replaced by barely controlled desperation. Diana, Thomas began the moment I entered, his voice carrying forced authority. I want you to know that these allegations are obviously retaliatory. You're clearly upset about yesterday's restructuring decision, but fabricating harassment claims, Thomas, Jennifer Walsh interrupted sharply. Our attorneys have advised against any discussion of the allegations without proper legal representation. I took my seat calmly, placing my portfolio on the table exactly where I'd left yesterday's resignation letter. Thomas's eyes fixated on it with obvious anxiety. Before we begin, I said quietly, I want to clarify something important. Yesterday's personnel decision and today's EEOC filing are completely separate matters. The harassment investigation began months before any restructuring announcements. Thomas's face flushed. That's impossible. I would have known about any formal investigation. You did know, I replied, opening my portfolio. Every victim who approached you was systematically dismissed. Every complaint that reached your desk was buried. Every woman who tried to report was threatened with career consequences. I pulled out a folder containing printed emails, Thomas's own words, documenting his systematic harassment cover-up. This is from Sarah Martinez's formal complaint 3 months ago, I read aloud. Thomas Blake's response: these allegations are clearly fabricated by a disgruntled employee seeking to create problems. I recommend we document her performance issues as grounds for potential termination. The color drained from Thomas's face as he recognized his own email signature. Here's his instruction to department heads about Jennifer Kim's complaint: handle these situations quietly and avoid unnecessary corporate drama. Some employees mistake professional mentorship for inappropriate behavior. Michael Torres looked sick. Thomas, you personally responded to these complaints? And here, I continued, is Thomas's email to Marcus Anderson last month. Diana's problematic dedication to employee complaints is becoming a liability. We need fresh leadership that understands business priorities. The room fell silent as 24 hours of assumptions collapsed. Thomas hadn't been managing corporate restructuring. He'd been systematically eliminating the one person investigating his predatory behavior. 6 women, I said quietly. 6 separate harassment complaints, all dismissed by the same CEO who yesterday claimed I wasn't leadership material. Thomas's hands were visibly shaking now. These women are lying. Diana manipulated them into making false accusations because she wanted revenge for not getting promoted. Actually, I replied, my voice steady with 22 years of professional authority. They trusted the HR director who'd spent decades protecting employees, the same expertise you dismissed as emotional overinvestment in employee issues. I looked directly at Thomas, watching his core identity, the successful CEO who controlled everything, begin to crumble. The unqualified director you fired had been building your termination case for months, using the same institutional relationships you never bothered to understand. His assumption about my capabilities was becoming the documented evidence of his destruction. The silence in the boardroom stretched for 30 seconds before Jennifer Walsh found her voice. Thomas, is everything Diana just presented accurate? Did you personally handle these harassment complaints? Thomas's confident CEO persona was disintegrating in real time. Those emails are taken out of context. Diana is twisting normal corporate communications to support her false narrative. Normal corporate communications? Michael Torres repeated, reading from the documents. You told department heads to suppress harassment complaints. You threatened victims with termination. You planned Diana's elimination to stop her investigation. I watched Thomas's identity as the competent leader collapse piece by piece. For years, he'd seen himself as the strategic CEO managing corporate challenges. Now the board was discovering he was actually a predator systematically covering up criminal behavior. The employment law firm represents all 6 victims, I continued calmly. Sarah Martinez, Jennifer Kim, Lisa Rodriguez, Amanda Foster, Rebecca Torres, and Maria Gonzalez. Each woman trusted the HR director you dismissed as not leadership material. Thomas tried one final desperate defense. Diana, you're destroying this company over a personal vendetta. Think about the jobs you're eliminating, the families you're hurting. I'm thinking about the women you systematically terrorized. I interrupted, my voice carrying the institutional authority he'd never recognized. The employees I spent 22 years protecting while you spent 24 months predating. Jennifer Walsh was reading legal projections from corporate counsel. The liability estimates are staggering. 8-figure settlement potential, criminal referrals for obstruction of justice, SEC investigation for corporate negligence. This is what happens, I said, looking directly at Thomas. When you systematically underestimate institutional expertise, when you dismiss decades of professional relationships as emotional investment, when you assume that firing the investigating officer ends the investigation. Thomas's hands were trembling as the complete scope of his miscalculation became clear. He'd thought he was managing a problematic employee. Instead, He'd been systematically creating evidence for the most comprehensive harassment prosecution in corporate history. The State Employment Rights Commission is reviewing your employment history across multiple companies, I added. Your pattern of predatory behavior isn't limited to Meridian. This case is just the beginning. Corporate counsel leaned toward Jennifer Walsh. We need immediate CEO suspension pending investigation. Criminal liability exposure requires complete separation from company operations. Thomas's face went white. You can't do this. I built this company. I made Meridian what it is today. Actually, I replied with quiet professional satisfaction, the employees you terrorized built this company. The women you threatened created this success. The institutional relationships you dismissed as worthless are what made Meridian profitable. I closed my portfolio and stood. The unqualified HR director you fired had institutional backing you never imagined, legal expertise you never respected, professional relationships you never understood. 22 years of protecting employees taught me something important. Predators always underestimate the people they abuse. They assume their victims are powerless. They forget that institutional memory belongs to the protectors, not the predators. Thomas sat frozen as security approached his chair. The CEO who'd dismissed my leadership qualifications was being escorted from his own boardroom by the institutional authority he'd never recognized I possessed. Jennifer Walsh approached me as Thomas was led away. Diana, the board would like to discuss your immediate return as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership. I smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction of a woman who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. I'd be honored to help Meridian recover from this crisis. Professional expertise tends to be useful during institutional emergencies. The woman Thomas dismissed as not leadership material was about to rebuild the company he'd nearly destroyed through his arrogance. Justice, delivered with perfect professional grace.